whether he's right, that these are the only three options and that this is the best option. We can have a chance to report on the groups. I'll give my own views about the strengths and weaknesses of these, and hopefully we'll have plenty of time after even that so that we can have question and answer. So much more time for discussion, less time for Kit to talk. Okay, so the naturalistic approach. This is probably the most popular approach in the literature, and this is the approach to human rights which is derived from natural law theory. And the idea behind this is that these are moral rights which humans have because of their nature. They're rights that all humans have in all places at all times. Okay? That's what it is to talk about human rights, according to the naturalistic approach. The chief example, according to Bates, of a naturalistic approach is John Locke. So John Locke says, even in a state of nature, a place where there's no government, there are moral rights. So these are pre-institutional, and these rights include the right to life, the right to liberty, and the right to property. And you don't lose these rights when you're in a government. It doesn't matter what government you're in or if you're out of government. Everywhere you are, you have these rights. Okay, so that's just one form of it. Why does Bates not like the naturalistic approach? Okay, there are several reasons. The first is, he says, when you look at the rights, when we look at the international human rights documents, they include loads of rights which don't make sense on this account. The right to political asylum, the right to free elementary education, the right to political participation. These are not rights that you'd have in the state of nature. These are rights that you'd only have in modern society, a world dominated by states. So if you want to account for these core, what most people think are core human rights, it seems like you can't do it according to the naturalistic approach. Another problem with the naturalistic approach is it looks exclusively at humans and what humans need, and so it explains what rights people want, but it tells us nothing about who the duty bearers are. Okay? And a related objection is that most people, when they think about contemporary human rights, think that the principal addressee is the political state. Okay? But according to a naturalistic approach, these rights would exist even in the absence of a state. So the naturalistic approach is more inclined to say, well, if there are duty bearers, it's going to be everybody. So it gives answers which are very different from much of the human rights movement. And then if you looked at the differences between what a naturalistic theorist said and maybe the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is that a naturalistic theory is just going to say, well, we need to change the list. We need to add some things which aren't on the list or take some things off. He said, that's not so clear. Okay? So because of these problems, Bates does not like the naturalistic approach. The idea that there's something about the nature of a human being which means that they all have these rights in all times and all places. He says that conflicts too much with what we mean now when we talk about human rights. Another approach is agreement theory. And agreement theory says that human rights and their authority come from a common agreement among all of the world's societies. Okay? So all of the world's cultures, all of the world's societies agree about certain things, about torture being bad, about there being a right to life, and things like this. And that's what makes them human rights, and that's what gives them their authority, is that everybody agrees. All the different cultures agree about this. And you can see why this is a very popular theory, why it has a lot of potential. In particular, one theoretical advantage is it seems to overcome the parochialism objection. I think Russ has talked about that. Has he talked about the parochialism objection? No?
He mentioned it.
They mentioned it. Okay. So here's the parochial objection. Suppose you've got a few powerful Western states who draw up a lot of the human rights documents, right? And they decide, oh, there's a right to democracy. There's a right to freedom of religion, okay? And they decide, these are human rights. These are rights for everybody in the world. Well, there are some cultures that don't agree with that. There are some cultures that think, no, we don't have democracy and we don't need democracy and there's no right to democracy. And there's no freedom of religion. There's one true religion. It's this religion, and that's why our state embraces this religion. So the parochialism objection is to say that some of the powerful countries, like the European countries and the United States and Canada and Australia, right, that these countries mistake their own personal values for being universal values, right? They say, for instance, to Asia, these are human rights and you're disrespecting them. And then the Asians come back and say, we don't believe those are human rights. We don't agree with you, okay? And so how can you impose them on us? We don't impose our values on you, and just because you call them human values, human rights, they're really just your values, okay? So if you're impressed by that objection, you'll love the agreement theories, because the agreement theory says that the human rights are just those rights that everybody, all the different cultures in the world agree about. And so it doesn't involve the North imposing certain rights on the South, or the West imposing certain rights on the East, or anything like this, because everybody agrees. Okay? And so they don't get their authority comes from the agreement. So why does Bates not like this approach? Bates thinks this is wrong for several reasons. First of all, when you look at the list of human rights and the core documents, there's not, in fact, agreement about them. Freedom of religion, equal rights of women, the rights of children, right to democracy. These are things about which there's not agreement. Okay? So if you take this approach, you're going to come to you're going to have a very restricted list of human rights that doesn't match anything like the documents. Okay? Second of all, societies and cultures don't have beliefs. People within the cultures have the belief. And it's a misdescription to say that everybody in the Ukraine believes this, or everybody in the United States believes this, right? Some believe, some don't, right? And so there's, in fact, not only is there disagreement in different parts of the world, in every society there is disagreement about what rights exist. All right? So you need to recognize that. A third problem is that human rights, a core feature of human rights is that they're critical. We use human rights to criticize society. So I talked yesterday about people criticizing the United States for the death penalty, for being a violation of the human right to life. Okay? But if human rights are only those things that everybody agrees with, we couldn't criticize anybody. Because we look at their practice, and if they weren't practicing it, they didn't agree with it. If they don't agree with it, it's not a human right. And we couldn't use human rights to criticize anybody. Right? And then finally, Bates says, look, this agreement theory gets it backwards. Like, think about genocide. Almost everybody agrees that genocide, there's a human right against genocide, or that genocide is a human rights violation. Okay? But presumably, what makes it a human right is the consequences of genocide, not the fact that everybody agrees. So everybody agrees that genocide is a human rights violation because of the consequences. And so it's the consequences that make it a human rights issue, not the agreement. So Bates thinks the agreement theory gets it wrong. Okay? So this is very quick, and to his credit, Bates does not say these theories can't be fixed or that every version of these theories is wrong. He just says there seem to be enough problems with the two popular approaches, the naturalistic approach and the agreement approach, that maybe we should try and develop a new theory, a new type of theory. And what he recommends is a practical approach. Okay? What is the practical approach? The practical approach is where you look at actual practice of the international human rights movement. So you don't look to your theory, you don't look to human nature, you don't look to what people agree about all over the world. You look at the human rights documents, you look at how people respond to them. Okay? And based upon what he thinks is an emerging practice, it's not a fully developed practice like a state. He thinks like the Ukraine as a state is a fully developed practice, whereas international human rights practice is only an emerging practice. But it's emerged enough, he thinks, that we can say a lot about it. And from this, he comes up with what he calls a two-level model based upon the practical. And it involves three components. So the first component is that human rights, he thinks, are protections for urgent individual interests, right? That humans are predictably vulnerable to in a modern world with political states. Okay? So he thinks that when you look at the documents, what they're trying to do is they're trying to protect individuals' urgent interests that might be threatened, that are going to be predictably threatened in a world, not any world, not a state of nature, but in a modern world where we have states. Okay? So that's the first element. The second element, this is when you see the second and third elements, you'll see why he calls it a two-level model, is that these interests are first and foremost to be protected by political institutions, namely your own state. And by this he thinks that your own state has a threefold responsibility to respect the rights of all of the human rights of all of its citizens, to protect the human rights of all of its citizens against potential non-state threats, and then to aid or assist those people who have involuntarily become human rights victims. So that's what, according to the practice, he says, that's what we expect first and foremost of states. But that's just the first level.
Could you please repeat this?
Sure.
Respect of human rights of all citizens?
Yeah. So the principal responsibility for human rights is a citizen state. Okay? And the state is supposed to respect its citizens' human rights in everything it does. It's supposed to protect its citizens' rights against non-state threats. Right? So it's not just that the state ought not to torture you. It's also that if I were going to torture you, the state should come in and protect you and punish me if I try. Okay? So it's respect, it's protect, and third of all, it's to aid or assist people who become victims. So suppose that there's you live in a country where there is an effective law, generally effective law against torturing, but nonetheless I torture you, right? Then it's the state's responsibility to help you, to assist you. Okay? So all of this is at the first level. It's according to the practice, Bites thinks, this is the principal responsibility of your state. Okay? But the third thing, the third element, is that there's a second level. And he said these human rights are what he repeatedly calls an international concern. And what does that mean? That means that for any reason your own state is not respecting or not protecting or not aiding victims, right? Then this gives external parties reasons. Importantly, he doesn't say necessarily duties. It gives reasons for them to act. And they can act in three ways, right? They can act by holding states accountable. So if a state is not protecting people against being tortured, or it's actually torturing them, then we would expect international actors, whether this be non-governmental organizations, whether it be particular states, whether it be supranational institutions like the United Nations, things like this. They should hold the individual country accountable. They should help where a country wants to, but it just doesn't have the means, is unable to perform its functions. They have reasons to help your government provide these functions. And they also, if your country is able but it's unwilling, then international actors have reason to interfere. Maybe military intervention, but that's only the most extreme case. But to interfere on your behalf, okay? And importantly, BITES doesn't think that there's necessarily a duty for international actors to do it, but that they have reasons to do it. And so this is what he calls the practical approach, which is what we can garner, what we can understand if we just look at the practice. Okay. Now, I want to see if there are any questions about any of this. Clear? Good. Okay. So here's what I'm interested in. So BITES has argued, so I yesterday offered a type of naturalistic account, the account that I give. And BITES has said this is why we should reject all naturalistic accounts and all agreement accounts. And we should have a different approach in trying to answer questions about the nature and the content of human rights. So the question I'd like all of us to explore this afternoon is, what approach should we take? All right? And I'm hoping that we'll break into groups and we'll have longer this time. It'll take half an hour if we want. And they'll still give us plenty of time to come back and talk about these things. About whether you might think the easiest thing is to think BITES is right. We should take the practical approach, and here's why. Okay? But you might also think, no, we should take the agreement approach or the naturalistic approach as he characterizes it, and here's why. Or you might think, no, he's right to criticize these approaches the way he characterizes it, but you can build a better naturalistic approach or a better agreement approach. Or maybe BITES is wrong. These aren't the only three options. Maybe there's another option, a different way to approach these things. Right? So the question for us that I'd like to explore this afternoon is, what approach should we take to this? I'm hoping that we'll come back and we'll report on our groups, and then I'll offer my thoughts about, I'll tell you in advance, I'm going to try and explain some concerns I have about the practical approach. And I'm going to admit there are some problems, he's right about some problems in the naturalistic approach, but my own view is that we try and repair the naturalistic approach. I'm hoping other people have different approaches, and so we can have a question and answer, we can talk about these things after we have all of our reports. Are we seated the same way we were yesterday? Do we need to count off again? Why don't we do groups of 5 again, so I'll count off because we may be in different things. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Group 1.